The moving truck rumbled up the cracked gravel driveway just as the afternoon sun slipped behind a blanket of gray clouds. Daniel slowed the vehicle to a stop, staring through the windshield at the property they had purchased only weeks earlier. It wasn't much to look at, an aging farmhouse with faded white siding, a sagging porch and acres of woodland stretching in every direction. But after years of living in a crowded suburb, it felt like the fresh start they desperately needed. His wife, Emily, smiled as she stepped out of the car, breathing in the cool mountain air while their 10-year-old daughter, Lily, raced across the overgrown yard with the excitement only a child could have. To them the silence felt peaceful. It didn't yet feel unnatural. The realtor had called the place a hidden gem, explaining that the previous owner had died without leaving any immediate family behind. The property had remained vacant for years while legal disputes delayed its sale, which explained the unusually low price. Daniel considered himself lucky. He ignored the nagging feeling that deals this good almost never came without a catch. The paperwork had been straightforward, the inspection had revealed only minor repairs, and every question about the property's history had been answered with vague but believable explanations. As they unpacked throughout the afternoon, Lily wandered farther from the house than either parent realized. She followed a narrow trail, disappearing into the trees until she suddenly stopped. Half hidden beneath tangled vines and towering pines stood a small wooden cabin. Time had weathered every inch of its exterior. Moss-covered portions of the roof, broken branches leaned against its walls, and thick ivy wrapped around the corners as though nature had been trying to reclaim it for decades. Yet one detail immediately caught her attention. A large iron padlock still secured the front door. It looked old, but strangely well preserved, almost as if someone had cared for it despite everything else being left to decay. When Daniel and Emily reached her, they assumed it had once been a storage shed or hunting cabin. Daniel tugged lightly on the lock before shrugging. Probably full of junk, he joked. Emily suggested leaving it alone until they finished settling into the house. There was plenty of time to explore later. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, none of them noticed the faded wooden post near the trail entrance. Age had nearly erased the painted letters, but one word remained barely visible beneath layers of peeling paint: return. That evening they drove into the nearest town to buy groceries and introduce themselves. The community was small enough that unfamiliar faces immediately drew attention. Friendly greetings followed them through the general store until an elderly cashier casually asked where they had moved from. Daniel proudly mentioned the farmhouse at the edge of Hollow Creek Road. The woman's smile disappeared almost instantly. She paused in the middle of scanning their items before quietly asking whether they had seen the cabin in the woods. Daniel laughed, saying they had found it only hours earlier and planned to clean it out eventually. The cashier lowered her eyes without another word. Behind them, the conversations throughout the store slowly faded into complete silence as if everyone had heard the exchange. By the time Daniel turned around, several customers were pretending to browse shelves while avoiding eye contact, their expressions carrying a mixture of fear and sympathy that made no sense to a family who believed they had simply purchased an old country home. The first few days passed quietly enough, and Daniel convinced himself that the awkward encounter at the grocery store had been nothing more than small-town superstition. There were fences to repair, boxes to unpack, and years of neglect to clean from the farmhouse. By sunset each evening, the family was exhausted, grateful for the peaceful isolation they had been searching for. Yet once darkness settled over the surrounding forest, that peaceful silence seemed to transform into something heavier. The woods no longer felt empty, they felt occupied. On the fourth night, Daniel woke just after 2 in the morning. At first, he thought the sound outside was a branch scraping across the roof. Then it came again. Slow, deliberate footsteps circled the house. They were too heavy to belong to a deer, and too measured to be an animal wandering through the trees. Whoever, or whatever, it was seemed to be walking around the farmhouse without any urgency, almost as if it were inspecting the property. Daniel climbed out of bed and quietly pulled back the bedroom curtain. Moonlight spilled across the yard, revealing nothing but swaying grass and dark tree lines. The footsteps continued for another minute, before stopping as suddenly as they had begun. The following morning, he grabbed a flashlight and searched the muddy ground around the house, expecting to find footprints. There were none. The damp earth should have preserved every mark, yet the soil remained perfectly undisturbed. Even stranger, the path leading toward the cabin looked untouched, despite the recent rain. Daniel tried to laugh it off, convincing himself exhaustion had distorted ordinary nighttime sounds. That afternoon, Lily wandered onto the porch carrying a drawing she had made with colored pencils. She proudly handed it to her mother, who smiled until she noticed the figure standing beside the cabin in the picture. It was an elderly man dressed in dark clothing, his face pale except for 2 dark circles where the eyes should have been. Emily asked who he was, assuming Lily had invented an imaginary character. The little girl answered without hesitation. "The old man by the cabin." Emily frowned. "What old man?" "The one who watches every evening. He never comes close. He just stands there, until it gets dark." A chill crept through Emily's body. She questioned Lily carefully, but her daughter insisted she had seen him every day since they moved in. He never spoke. He never waved. He simply stood as among the trees facing the house before disappearing into the woods as the sun went down. Emily mentioned the conversation to Daniel, who immediately searched the property before sunset. He found nothing except the abandoned cabin standing exactly where it had always been. The forest was silent. No footprints surrounded the building, and no signs suggested anyone had visited recently. That night the footsteps returned. This time they didn't circle the farmhouse. They stopped outside Lily's bedroom window. Daniel rushed outside with a flashlight, expecting to catch a trespasser before they escaped. The beam swept across the yard, over the trees, and finally toward the trail leading to the cabin. For only a fraction of a second, he thought he saw someone standing between the pines. A tall figure remained perfectly still, watching him from the darkness before vanishing the instant the flashlight settled on the spot where it had been. By the end of the second week, curiosity had begun to outweigh caution. The strange footsteps returned almost every night. Lily continued insisting that the silent old man appeared near the cabin at dusk, and the uneasy silence from the townspeople lingered in Daniel's mind. Every attempt to ignore the cabin only seemed to make it more impossible to forget. It had become the center of every unanswered question surrounding their new home. One cool Saturday morning, Daniel gathered a crowbar, a hammer, and a pair of heavy bolt cutters. Emily hesitated before following him down the narrow trail through the woods, while Lily was instructed to remain inside the farmhouse with the doors locked. As they approached the cabin, the surrounding forest seemed unnaturally quiet. There were no birds calling from the trees, no insects buzzing beneath the leaves, not even the sound of wind moving through the branches. The silence pressed against them like an invisible weight. The weathered padlock still hung from the door exactly as they had left it. Daniel examined it closely. Although the iron looked decades old, it showed surprisingly little corrosion. It almost seemed as though someone had replaced it recently, yet the chain securing it was ancient. After several minutes of struggling with the bolt cutters, the lock finally snapped apart with a sharp metallic crack that echoed through the woods. The sound seemed far louder than it should have been, disappearing into the forest before an eerie stillness returned. The cabin door refused to move at first. Daniel shoved against it with his shoulder until the swollen wood groaned open, releasing a rush of cold air that smelled neither rotten nor dusty. Instead it carried the faint scent of cedar and old paper, as though the room had somehow been preserved from time itself. Emily expected cobwebs, collapsed furniture, and years of decay. Instead, everything looked strangely untouched. A wooden table stood neatly in the center of the room with a lantern resting on top. Shelves along the walls held glass jars, books, and carefully folded blankets. A rocking chair faced the fireplace as though someone had only stepped away moments earlier. Dust covered the floor, but the furniture itself remained remarkably clean. Nothing appeared vandalized, nothing looked abandoned. Daniel slowly walked farther inside, noticing something that made his stomach tighten. There were footprints in the dust, not old footprints, fresh ones. They began near the fireplace, crossed the room, and stopped directly in front of the door where he and Emily now stood. There were no matching prints leading back inside, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished before reaching the entrance. Emily whispered that they should leave immediately, but Daniel's attention shifted toward a small writing desk beneath the only window. Resting neatly on its surface was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age yet carefully protected beneath a folded cloth. Beside it sat a pocket watch that had long since stopped ticking, a pair of reading glasses, and a ceramic mug containing what looked like dried tea leaves. Everything had been arranged with deliberate care, untouched by time. Daniel lifted the journal carefully. As he opened the first yellowed page, he noticed something written in dark ink across the inside cover. Asterisk: if this book is open, then the lock has failed. Daniel carried the journal back to the farmhouse, unable to shake the feeling that removing it from the cabin had been a mistake. Emily locked every door before they sat together at the kitchen table, the old leather-bound book resting between them beneath the dim glow of a single lamp. The pages were brittle with age, yet the handwriting remained remarkably clear. The earliest entries described ordinary days spent repairing fences, collecting firewood, and maintaining the small cabin. It read like the diary of a quiet man living peacefully in the woods. But as the weeks passed, the tone slowly changed. The sentences became shorter, more hurried, and filled with repeated warnings that made little sense on their own. One passage described strange knocking beneath the cabin floor just after midnight. At first, the writer believed trapped animals had burrowed underneath the foundation. He searched for broken boards and dug around the edges of the structure, but found nothing. The knocking continued every night, growing louder with each passing week. Soon it was joined by whispers that seemed to drift upward through the wooden floorboards, speaking words too faint to understand. The writer admitted he had begun sleeping with a lantern burning until sunrise, because complete darkness made the voices stronger. Further into the journal, the entries revealed that he was not alone. A neighboring family had heard the same sounds and insisted they were coming from somewhere beneath the hill itself. Together they searched the surrounding woods until they discovered an old stone opening, hidden beneath fallen leaves, a short distance behind the cabin. The entrance descended into narrow tunnels carved long before anyone could remember. The walls were covered with strange markings that none of them recognized. They explored only a short distance before hearing echoing somewhere ahead, despite knowing everyone in their group was standing perfectly still. The journal became increasingly frantic after that day. The writer claimed the neighboring family began changing. They stopped making eye contact. They wandered outside after sunset without remembering doing so. Their youngest son repeatedly drew pictures of a black doorway beneath the earth, insisting someone wanted them to return. One by one, they disappeared into the forest during the night. Search parties found no bodies, no footprints, and no signs of struggle. It was as though the woods had quietly erased them from existence. The final entries were written in uneven handwriting that shook across the pages. The writer confessed he could hear someone calling his name from beneath the cabin every evening, using the voices of people who had already vanished. He believed whatever lived below had learned how to imitate those it had taken. Desperate to stop anyone else from investigating, he sealed the hidden entrance beneath the cabin, reinforced the floor, and locked the building before abandoning the property forever. The very last page contained only 3 short sentences. They weren't trapped down there. They wanted us to believe that. The lock was never meant to keep people out. It was meant to keep something from finding its way back up. The final words in the journal refused to leave Daniel's mind. Every logical explanation he had relied upon, since moving to the property, had collapsed beneath the weight of what they had discovered. He told himself the entries were nothing more than the writings of a frightened man slowly losing his grip on reality, yet each passing night made that explanation harder to believe. The footsteps outside had grown louder. Lily claimed the old man no longer stood near the cabin. Now he stood much closer to the farmhouse, watching from the edge of the yard. Even Emily admitted she had begun hearing soft knocking beneath the floor late at night, always in the same slow rhythm described in the journal. Unable to ignore the warnings any longer, Daniel returned to the cabin one last time. Armed with flashlights, rope, and a shovel, he and Emily searched every corner of the small building. The room appeared unchanged, but the journal had mentioned reinforcing the floor before abandoning the property. Daniel knelt beside the fireplace and noticed faint scratches surrounding several wide wooden planks. They looked newer than the rest of the flooring. Using the crowbar he pried them loose one by one until a rush of icy air escaped from the darkness below. Hidden beneath the cabin was a narrow stone staircase descending into the earth. The stale air carried the smell of damp soil and ancient stone. Every step echoed through the darkness as though the tunnel stretched far beyond the reach of their flashlights. Strange symbols covered the walls, carved deeply into the rock centuries earlier. Some resembled circles broken by jagged lines, while others looked almost like distorted human figures reaching upward. The deeper they descended, the quieter the world above became, until even their own breathing seemed distant. Eventually the passage opened into a vast underground chamber supported by crumbling stone pillars. Broken lanterns, rusted tools, and scattered belongings lay across the ground, silent evidence that others had reached this place before them. Among the debris Daniel recognized a child's faded shoe, an old pocket watch matching the one from the cabin, and several weathered backpacks coated in dust. None appeared old enough to have rested there for 19 years. Then they found the wall. Dozens of names had been carved into the stone, each marked with a different date. Some were decades apart, others only months. The final name had no date beside it. It simply read, "Next family." A low voice drifted through the darkness. At first it sounded like distant wind. Then Emily realized it was whispering Lily's name. The chamber answered with dozens of overlapping voices repeating it again and again until the sound surrounded them from every direction. Their flashlights flickered violently as shadows began moving across the walls, without any visible source. Daniel grabbed Emily's hand and turned toward the staircase, only to discover it was no longer there. In its place stood an endless stretch of darkness, where the tunnel had been only moments before, while somewhere behind them slow footsteps echoed across the stone floor, growing steadily closer with each passing second, as though something that had waited beneath the cabin for 19 years had finally realized the lock was gone, and it was no longer alone,